We're still hoping more people will join us, but I think we're going to get started right now. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Thank you both to our speakers and thank you to our guests and participants. We really appreciate your interest in and support for this event. I'm David LePage. I'm the coordinator and director of Fossil Free South Africa, which is a network of South Africans working to secure human rights and prosperity by challenging financial and social support for the fossil fuel industry specifically. And tonight's event is intended to explore some of the environmental and colonial dimensions of the current genocide being committed in Gaza by Israel. I'm being supported tonight by my colleague Emma Fukwe, who is our Fossil Free South Africa events and community coordinator. I also want to acknowledge the huge contribution of our colleague Tamina Danze, who is our Fossil Free South Africa social media officer and fossil and ban campaigner. Together, Tamina and Emma have done a lot of the research and planning for this event and for a follow-up event that we'll be having soon. So thank you both very much, Emma and Tamina. We realize that the subject of what is happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, is a sensitive and difficult subject for many people. We hope that tonight's discussion will help us all understand this issue more deeply in respect of the fundamental human rights dimensions, the current assaults on the Palestinian people, and the nature of life in Gaza, both before and after 7th of October. Our starting point is that the lives and human rights of all people, whether Palestinian or Israeli, Jewish or Muslim, should be held sacred, and that all people, whatever their nationality, ethnicity, religion or gender, should be able to live lives free from violence, whether that violence is political, military or environmental, and even more than that, be supported in leading lives of sustainable prosperity, freedom and community. We do not support or endorse human rights abuses or war crimes or crimes against international law by any party. We acknowledge the long and deep suffering and dispossession of the Palestinian people from the Nakba onwards, and the current system of apartheid imposed by the Israeli government on Palestinians through the war in Gaza, the all too long siege and blockade of Gaza, and the occupation of the West Bank. We also fully acknowledge the long and deep history of terrible persecution, pogroms, and the Holocaust suffered by Jewish people, many of whom now, of course, live in Israel. Our order of events tonight will be as follows. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and after Tara, Nina, and Fadi have spoken for around 10 to 15 minutes each, I will also speak a little more about why we as Fossil Free South Africa are hosting this event, and tell you about the further in-person event we have on Gaza planned for the 3rd of August. Following our presentations, we'll have a little conversation between ourselves as panelists before turning to your questions. Please feel free to ask whatever you wish to ask, but please also keep the tone of your questions as respectful and considerate as possible. A lot of the online debate around Gaza has been argumentative and judgmental, and that while we understand that these issues deserve very passionate engagement, we hope here to have a calm conversation that contributes to greater understanding for everyone. So our first panelist this evening is Tara van Reineveld, who is the Climate Policy Coordinator at the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute and co-facilitator of the Economic Justice Working Group for the Climate Justice Coalition here in South Africa. Tara has done much research on and writing about decolonial approaches to development and just energy transitions. Our second panelist, Nina Lakhani, is the justice reporter at The Guardian US. She has 17 years of experience reporting globally, and as a former mental health nurse, Nina brings a unique perspective to environmental journalism in particular. Then Fadi Quran is the senior director at the global people-powered campaigning community Avaaz, focusing on transformative leadership in the Middle East and North Africa, human rights advocacy and Palestinian liberation. He is also an innovator in alternative energy with successful wind and solar ventures in Palestine, and he's joining us this evening from the West Bank. As I mentioned, I'm the director and coordinator of Fossil Free South Africa, and my background is as a human rights and science journalist with experience from organizations like the Mail and Guardian, Treatment Action Campaign, and SAFSI. So I'd like to now hand over to Tara as our first speaker. Thank you so much, Tara.
Thanks, David, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share a platform with some really esteemed guests. And I want to start off my contribution by saying that I really don't have all the answers. I am no expert. Dave, I think you're unmuted. Yeah. I don't have all the answers, and I am coming from this from a very particular perspective, with a recognition not of any kind of ancestral or religious connection to what's going on, but purely as a human. I deeply believe that decolonization is fundamental to building a climate just world. And that's kind of my entry point into this conversation. I moved through this world as a mixed race South African woman who has ancestors on both sides of the colonial project. And I think that's important to recognize as I enter this contribution. And as David mentioned, I did my research on how coloniality perpetuates fossil fuel dependence and fossil fuel centered development in South Africa and undermines resistance and alternative modes of development and envisionings of a climate just world. And I'm going to stick my contribution to 3 points. Like, there's so many different layers and entry points that one could take. But my first point is that there is a colonial history to the story of climate change, and it's really important that we engage with it. And I'm not just talking about how the impacts of climate change are disproportionately being placed on those who have historically been dispossessed by the systems of colonization and the colonial project. I'm talking about the history of climate change in the sense that we often talk about the explosion of emissions linked to the Industrial Revolution, but we overlook the fact that the colonies provided resources for the Industrial Revolution, as well as a market for the expansion of capitalism and the consumption of products that were produced by the Industrial Revolution. So it's really important that we recognize those underpinnings in the causal story of how climate change and the climate crisis came to be. And that links to my second point, which is why highlight these underpinnings. And it's because it shapes how we engage and pose solutions to the climate crisis. If we are not cognizant of the logics underpinning the climate crisis, we will turn a blind eye to the land grabs that happen on the African continent in sort of arguing for fixing of carbon emissions of the elite global north. We will turn a blind eye to extractive violence in the DRC along the value chain of critical minerals needed in the energy transition. And it's really important that we recognize these capitalist and colonial underpinnings, both of modernity and the climate crisis, because it informs how we are thinking about what solutions and what logics are going to be perpetuated in the solutions we pose. As I've said, I'm not an expert on Gaza, and my link is to the sort of interweavings of colonialism and capitalism in the context of the climate crisis. So I make my third point with that caveat. My third point is linked in particular to settler colonialism and how settler colonialism interweaves with capitalism to disrupt connection to land and our ability to care for land and our ability to be cared for land, by the land. And I think many people who are way more experienced than me have talked about how settler colonialism is structural. It's not a singular colonial conquest that then comes to an end and linked to the ideological imaginings of state. But there are many examples of the settler colonial project in South Africa, how it's been linked to the history of land dispossession and land displacements, and similarly in Palestine. But I want to talk about two specific examples, one in Palestine and one in South Africa, to show and hopefully open up the conversation with the other panelists for this interweaving between colonialism and capitalism in both undermining indigenous connection and presence on the land and the ability to protect the land, but also undermining climate resilience and ability to have autonomy over one's climate resilience. And the first case is around agriculture in the West Bank. And again, noting my positionality in this, but yeah, Palestine has a long history of agriculture and dating back thousands of years, and it really, prior to the occupation, Palestine was a net exporter of agricultural products, and today is a net importer. And the erosion of that agricultural sector, we can point to some key events. One of them is the annexation of water. So people are not able to get access or make use of water that falls on their land. They can't build infrastructure that allows them to make use of that to grow. There's the other one that is perhaps most obvious is the complications around actually accessing land, the checkpoints and myriads of permits that one has to navigate to just be able to access agricultural land. And in that context, I think it's relevant to draw attention to the most recent land grab of 12.7 square kilometers in the Jordan Valley, which was the largest since 1997. The Jordan Valley, as I understood in my process of preparing for this, is also where a lot of the really good quality agricultural land is located, and also where a lot of the settlements are located. So this connection, becomes more clearer as we unpack that. So farmers must contend not only with expanding settlements and the annexing of their land to the state, but they also need to navigate through these permits and checkpoints through this increasingly fragmented terrain. And then we have the opening up of markets, which for some would think is this great thing that now Palestinian products can be exported and can compete with Israeli products on the international market. But because Palestinian farmers have to navigate this complex system, Palestinian agricultural produce ends up being much more expensive. So it cannot compete in prices with Israeli products. Plus, Israeli products then that are sort of not good for export are dumped on the West Bank at lower prices than Palestinian produce, undercutting the local Palestinian farmers' ability to sort of capture their local market at the very least. And that's not even to go into the whole complexities of how Israeli waste and industries get moved to the West Bank, and the pollution then has to be dealt with by those, and it sort of underpins this narrative and this logic of whose lives do we sort of sacrifice, whose lives are not considered sort of worthy of protecting, whose health do we sacrifice in pursuit of these big sort of projects. And just a point here that of the 3 imports South Africa has from Israel, one of those top 3 imports is agrochemicals, and there's obviously a long history in South Africa of the big agribusiness being complicit in the colonial dispossession of land in the South African context. So there's a narrative there. So now I want to move to my second example, and I hope I'm not over time here. But my second example is within a South African context, and I want to again highlight how these systems of colonialism and capitalism interweave to undermine climate action and connection to land in the South African context. And I make this example specifically to highlight that these systems don't just come to an end because you have an administrative end of a colonial government. In the South African context, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has really stepped into this role of perpetuating colonial dispossession of land for capitalist extraction. And so we saw this with the case where DMRE was colluding with Shell in the most recent case, which actually Shell lost, the court case where communities were not consulted adequately, and as a result of not being consulted adequately, Shell didn't take into account how their livelihoods would be impacted by exploration off the east coast of South Africa, and also how their spiritual and customary rights to and connection to the ocean wasn't considered in that whole process. But just to note that because of the way that the bureaucratic system of the courts is that these exploration rights were not completely set aside. So there's still opportunity for Shell to go back and sort of conduct a good consultation process. And this is not the first time that this community, Olobeni, has actually had to go to court. They had to previously go to court to resist titanium mining by an Australian mining company. And during the apartheid period, they were, in the 1960s, there was the Ponderland Revolt, and it was the same communities that were involved. And so what you're seeing there is this story of the logics of the pressure and erosion of a connection to land that the colonial extractive development project puts forward and still persists despite the supposed end of apartheid and supposed end of these colonial systems. And that's because we're still located within a global system of colonialism and capitalism. And, you know, despite supposed political sovereignty, despite all these international climate agreements, 48 out of 55 African countries have fossil fuel development or exploration projects currently and counting. And predominantly those are being conducted by companies that have their headquarters in the global north with the intention of extraction for a way out of the African continent, and not addressing energy poverty, with huge repercussions on people's livelihoods and ability to live off the land. And also often these become then sites of high levels of violence, like in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. And so just to conclude my contribution, these systems and logics of capitalism and colonialism have intertwined to cause the climate crisis that we see today. And they simultaneously underpin the dehumanization and oppression of people around the world. And that is the system at work that we see in Palestine. It's the system at work that we see in Gaza. It's the systems at work elsewhere around the world. And we cannot expect these systems of capitalism and colonialism that created the climate crisis to be able to pose solutions to it. And if we are truly to address the climate crisis, if we're truly to address working towards a climate just future, it means that we have an obligation to recognize, to call out and stand in solidarity when we see these systems of oppression at work. And that is the only way that we can really work towards building a climate just future for all of us. Yeah, so that's my contribution. I'm sorry if it was a bit long. And yeah, if I didn't adequately focus on Gaza, but as I said, that's not my expertise. So yeah.
Tara, thank you very much. I think you really well illuminated some of the common threads that run through these particular struggles and difficulties, and you were perfectly on time, so please don't be anxious on that score. I'd now like to hand over to Nina. Thank you, Nina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. You can hear me, right? Yep. Yeah, okay. To echo Tara, as a journalist, I'm an expert in absolutely nothing. So I can just share with you, I guess, my reporting on, you know, I'm based in the US at the moment. I have worked in lots of different countries, but I'm based in the US. And I guess since October, I have been trying to contribute something in terms of sort of some, you know, reporting to give some accountability to the environmental destruction and the climate catastrophe that this horrific, you know, genocide in Gaza is also causing. I just want to caveat again by saying, you know, by focusing on the environment, by focusing on water and food and farmland and, you know, carbon emissions, it's not as an alternative to be thinking about the huge direct human impact that's happening now, and that's certainly some criticism I've come under, I think, over the last few months. This isn't an either or, it's an ecocide, a climate catastrophe is unfolding at the same time and is part of the genocide that's taking place. And what I'm going to do is just maybe talk briefly about 3 or 4 stories that I've written. I'll share my screen just briefly before I talk about each one. So if people are more interested, they can go and have a look at them. But I guess I'll start with like a short anecdote. So back at the end of November last year, so that I think we were like 6 weeks into Israel's assault on Gaza, I was in Dubai for COP28. And it was, I don't know, for all of you that have been to these climate negotiations, then, they're terrible in so many ways, but this was particularly just, we were so close in some, like relatively speaking, so close to Gaza. And, it was climate justice activists who were trying, were absolutely rightly trying to focus and draw attention to the intersection between climate justice and the genocide and the land grabs and the occupation, were being censored at every single step. People who called out Israel in press conferences were having their credentials being taken away, or at least threatened being removed. There was and there was a real divide in the environmental sort of, I guess, space and the movement, with a whole bunch of folks thinking, and very sort of, what's the word, I guess, organizations, influential organizations and individuals who continue to say that this isn't our issue, right? This isn't something for the environmental world to be talking about. Politics isn't what we do. And, if anyone that's read anything that I have ever written will know that I fundamentally, disagree with that on every single level, and have tried, I guess, in my reporting to make those links. At COP28, I interviewed, I went to meet Hadil Ikmais, who is the climate, I guess, I'll call her a climate minister, that's not her official, but she's like the leading climate official in the environmental Department of Environment for Palestine, based in Ramallah. And she said to me, before October the 7th, before this current onslaught in Gaza, the biggest existential threat facing Palestinians was the climate crisis. And that has now been, and why was that? Because of the Israel's occupation and control over water resources, over land resources, but also their ability, Palestine's ability to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis, right? So she gave me examples such as, being awarded a grant, a World Bank grant, maybe for some technology, for some renewable technology, because Palestinians have no direct access to ports or airports. That technology, whatever it might be, would be kept by the Israeli occupying force for months, sometimes indefinitely, hugely impacting Palestine's environment department's ability to actually, mitigate and adapt to things like sea level rise, the saltwater incursion into the aquifers because of the dense population in Gaza, etc. And so from that conversation with her, I sort of went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and just started looking and found some researchers who were interested in looking at the climate, specifically at the carbon impact of this particular military assault, which I know is like, I understand that it's a sort of a very particular thing to do. It's not, it's sort of, but I think it's important to do, right? Because these, we are in a position, and where actually military emissions contribute about 5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions every year, without taking into account wars. And those emissions are not counted on the international by the UN, and that is a result of the US campaigning and winning very hard to not have military missions counted. They're completely unaccounted for, right? So we, at the point where we are already in climate catastrophe, we are, these sort of emissions which are entirely avoidable are never counted, and they're never accounted for, and people don't have to take action on. The US military, without even thinking about any wars that it's involved in, is the fourth or fifth largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions annually, right? Just that aside. So anyway, we sort of went down, and I found some research, and we've now done 2 stories looking at the sort of the greenhouse gas emissions that can be directly linked to the bombs, the tanks, the artillery, the sort of bombardment and the destruction of Gaza. And we've also looked at the sort of climate cost of rebuilding Gaza, right? So 200,000 buildings, not more, and that was the last story we did was back in March, have been destroyed or partially destroyed. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly so you can sort of have a look at this. Sorry, let me just show you this quickly. Where is that? Can I find that? Yeah, and so we've looked at, and I think it is really, really important to do this, right? Because I think it's not one or the other. I'm just going to share this. Sorry, I'm not very good at this, but let me just share this really quickly. Okay.
Don't be anxious about the tech stuff.
Okay. Okay. This is just one. Okay, so this is like one story, right, that we did, and just, I guess, to say, let me see if I can just get back to this for a second. Sorry, this is my email. You don't need to say that. Okay. Oh, I don't know how to do this. I'm sorry. Let me get out of it. Doesn't matter. Let me stop sharing. Okay, doesn't matter. But yeah, so one of the stories that we did looked at showed that to reconstruct the buildings that have been and the infrastructure that has been destroyed in Gaza during the first 4 months of this particular assault by Israel is the equivalent of the greenhouse gas emissions of 120 countries, the annual greenhouse gas emissions of 120 countries, right? And this is so that's sort of one way of trying to account for the environmental, I guess, and the climate impact of this war. And I keep just stress again, this is not instead of accounting for the direct toll, but in a country like Palestine, which is so vulnerable to the climate crisis for the reasons I've already discussed, for a region which is so vulnerable to the climate crisis, this is really important. I think it's really important that we account for those. So that's sort of one part of the reporting I've been doing. Colleagues of mine have also looked at sort of the destruction, the ecocide and the domicide, so the widespread destruction of land, farmland, homes, all of that, which it has a huge environmental cost in terms of the pollution that it leaves behind, of the poison of the land, which has been targeted. I also did a story a couple of months ago. I interviewed Michael Thackeray, who some of you might know. He is the UN Special Rapporteur for the human right to food, who I've worked with on and off over the years, in which he talked about the sort of why he was talking about why deliberately starving and Palestinians in Gaza amounts to genocide, and he laid out the case for that. And then part of that has been the sort of, what's the word, blocking of aid, but it's also, and it's really important, I think, it has been a deliberate targeting of food supplies and water supplies in Gaza, right? So targeting of farmland, of greenhouses, of bakeries, all the sort of systems and structures in place that enabled Palestinians to produce their own food has been targeted, right? At the same time, and we've and that is as much as that is what is stopping Palestinians being able to feed themselves, right? The aid is a result of the war and a result of, you know, people need the aid because their own food supplies have been completely destroyed. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to go back one step. One of the we did this calculation on greenhouse gas emissions. We did the first one for the first 60 days of the war, and the second one looking at the first 120 days. And the 120 days one, we were the researchers were also able to calculate, for example, the emissions that are directly linked to the aid trucks now having to go in, or at least the ones that are being allowed to go in to provide basic necessities, right, for Palestinians to just sort of survive. We know that's not been enough, and that those figures don't even take into account the emissions related to the fuel costs of getting food to Egypt, right, and where that's coming from. It also, the most recent calculations take into account the fact that now in Gaza, where actually was very a huge amount of, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but this is what we had in our piece, that, you know, that a lot of Palestinians in Gaza use solar energy, use renewable energy because of the destruction of those solar renewable projects. Now there's a huge reliance on diesel powered generators and the carbon cost of that and the pollution of that. So we've tried in these pieces to, I guess, sort of calculate and hold to account to have some sort of environmental and climate accountability to this, to the genocide. Just two other things I wanted to mention. One, and this is sort of a direct thing, maybe a few weeks ago, I worked with Oil Change International and some researchers at Data Desk, and they tracked all of the oil, I think from October till March. They tracked using satellite imagery, satellite data and other data. They tracked the oil deliveries, imports to Israel, which have been fueling, you know, which Israel relies on, obviously, for its military as well as domestic use. The US is the only country that has continued to supply Israel with refined jet fuel, and we were able to show that since October, the US has sent 3 massive shipping tankers of jet fuel from Texas to Israel. One of them left before October the 7th, 2 left after, and one of those shipments actually left after the January ICJ ruling, in which they, you know, the interim ruling when they, when the court said there was a plausible case for genocide. There is, and the US was very clear that it did not plan to change its policy, whether it came to shipping fuel for Israel military jets or sending bombs or other artillery and weapons. That has continued to happen. Also in that story, that research, we found that other big suppliers of unrefined oil products have been the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, but also very surprising, and some neighboring countries, in Gulf countries as well, but then to a much smaller extent. Possibly one of the most surprising was actually Brazil. And you know, obviously the president of Brazil has been very outspoken in his criticism, has made of Israel's genocide, has withdrawn their ambassador. Just yesterday, I think, or the day before, signed a trade agreement with the state of Palestine. But as of you know, in the first few months, but has not banned oil exports coming from Brazilian oil fields to Israel, which we know the Israeli military is using. We're hoping to this research went up until the end of February, beginning of March. We're hoping to update it to see whether that has changed. And none of these governments got back to us with any responses. So, but that's what we were able to track. How am I for time? Just really, have I got time to talk about one other thing? Yeah.
Yes, I think very quickly, please, Tina. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and just one other thing then. I think, you know, just obviously we're concentrating here on the last 9 months, but water is a very good example of like, you know, the occupation of land and land grabs in the role that you know, the colonial occupying force Israel has on Palestinians' ability to, and their right to a safe to access to safe drinking water, to a healthy environment, etc. I did a story in November last year, and we were able to, with the Pacific Institute, who's an organization that tracks water and violence globally, and we were able to show that between the start of start of 2022 and mid 2023, so before this current assault by Israel, Israeli settlers backed by Israeli military attacked civilian water supplies in the West Bank more frequently than Russia had attacked civilian water supplies in Ukraine since the start of the war. And when I talk about attacks on water supplies, we're talking about things like settlers going to an to a Palestinian home, pouring poison or concrete into their water well so they can no longer access their water well. Israeli militaries, I think in June last year, the Israeli military on one occasion destroyed a water pump that left 20,000 Palestinians in the West Bank without water, cutting irrigation piping, so olive trees and other farmland can't be watered. So this is like part of a pattern, right, that has been going on for a long time. And it's part of the occupation, as Tara, said. This is part of the, this is a part of the colonial project, which the Palestinians' right to a healthy, clean, safe environment, to water, to food, to self-sufficiency in food, is all under attack. And what we've seen, I guess, since October is just an absolute sort of, huge uptick and to a surge in all of this, and the climate sort of implications and environment implications of this, I think, are really important to understand alongside as part of this sort of whole story, and understanding of genocide and of this whole colonial project. That's it.
Thanks so much, Nina. I really think that although the things that you've been describing are not part of the immediate atrocities that we're seeing at the moment, that they really help to illuminate the context in which those atrocities are occurring, and are incredibly important for people to understand that broader dimension. And I'd really like to now hand over to Fadi to respond to some of the points that have been raised and to help us better understand from your perspective and where you are in particular some of these issues. Thank you so much, Fadi.
Thank you, David. Excuse me. I'm going to start by saying something similar to what Tara and Nina said, which is that I'm not an expert on particularly the topic of climate change per se and environmental harm. Although I do work outside of just Palestine with indigenous communities. And I also say this because after both Tara and Nina said that, they presented very eloquent presentations. And so I'm hoping that by saying that, I can be almost as eloquent as they were. But my background for those listening is that as a senior director at Avaaz, I have helped lead global campaigns working with indigenous communities, not just within Palestine, of course, but also in places like the Amazon, in places across the continent of Africa. And just to double down on the point that Tara mentioned, which is we need to understand that environmental extraction and devastation and the politics of domination are the right and left arms of settler colonial entities. And they've been so for centuries, and they continue to be so in the context of Palestine, but also in the context globally. So it is wrong to assume that we can end environmental devastation and destruction and extraction without ending the systems of political and economic domination that go hand in hand with them. And anyone who is trying to challenge one of those arms without the other is probably going to be will sadly fail in achieving any change on either front. And to the points that Nina spoke to, I just want to emphasize how important the research and work that she has done has been, and putting kind of the numbers and helping us understand the toll of the environmental cost of this genocide on Gaza is crucial for us to understand. one number I pulled out, I'm a physicist actually by training, and it's one of my hobbies. And before this call and before kind of hearing Nina speak, I tried to do just an estimate of the CO2 emissions of the over 70,000 tons of bombs dropped on Gaza, along with the over 7,700 flight sorties of F-16s and other aircraft to drop these bombs. And just the CO2 emissions of those two, dropping these bombs on Gaza, near about 500,000 tons of CO2. And that, if my calculations serve me correctly, that's about 260,000 round-trip flights between New York and London. That's how much CO2 has been produced
Fadi?
by these bombs. And just, yes, sorry. Do you hear me?
Yes, sorry, you just dropped out from my side for a moment, but I can hear you again. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so I was just saying that just the amount of bombs that were dropped on Gaza and the flights needed to drop them produced close to 500,000 tons of CO2 emissions. And you all need to, for those of you in South Africa, you need to remember that Gaza is about 1/4 the size of Johannesburg. So if you know the city of Johannesburg, Gaza is 1/4 the size. So imagine that much just toxicity on such a small area. It's mind-boggling what that can do. Even if you aren't hit by those bombs, which sadly data indicates that at least 1 out of 10 people in Gaza have been injured or killed by those bombs. But even if you're not hit with those bombs, just the toxic fumes that they are releasing in such a small area is astonishing. But I don't want to, I could go on and speak to the level of harm that's caused by the Israel settler, colonial, and apartheid policies on us as Palestinians. I can speak about how even in the West Bank, I don't have water in my house currently because Israel cuts off the water and takes all of the water in the West Bank from underneath our feet and delivers it back to Israel for large agricultural farms, where they then destroy Palestinian farms and sell us products farmed on our stolen land from our stolen water at multiple times the cost. I can go through all of those details, but I assume, particularly for people in South Africa, that the harms and suffering caused by apartheid, caused by the violence of domination and settler colonialism is something you have enough experience with. So I won't go down that details because I prefer to say something that I believe is controversial, but actually true, and argue for it, which is I believe we can end the climate crisis by liberating Palestine. And I'm going to explain how that is potentially possible. And I will say that if we don't succeed, and this will be my second argument that I'll speak to quickly, if we don't succeed in ending the climate crisis by liberating Palestine, Palestine may succeed in teaching the world how to survive under a global climate crisis with limited resources, which is what we're forced to live right now, and not waiting until 2030 or 2040. So the argument I would make is that we all know in order to prevent the rise of global temperatures over 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 within the next decade, we will need to decrease fossil fuel burning by 30 to 50%, depending on the calculations. Now, 48% of fossil fuel reserves are in the Middle East and North Africa, and about 38% of fossil fuel sold comes from the region here. Now, one of the main reasons that Israel has been allowed to continue its system of oppression against Palestinians and has received so much US support, along with Arab countries in the Gulf that are the key fossil fuel producers, is that the US has sought to maintain its hegemony over the region because of these natural resources and the borders that have been designed across the region. The colonial borders that have been designed were not designed by the indigenous peoples of the Middle East and North Africa. They were designed by people named Churchill and other silly names that don't belong to our region. And consequently, in order to maintain them, that political apparatus, The US, one of the main reasons the US sends weapons to Israel, as Nina mentioned, one of the main reasons the US continues to fund Israel in its attacks has nothing to do with shared values. Although the US and Israel do share a value of trying to erase native communities, but it doesn't have to do with that. In fact, it has to do with the idea that Israel is one of the key aircraft carriers and weapon holders for the US. And without the presence of Israel, US hegemony in the region would be shaken. That's why you also see key fossil fuel producing countries, including Saudi Arabia, including the UAE and other countries, trying to maintain relations with Israel, to maintain this political system. Now, if Palestinians, and what are Palestinians truly seeking? The Palestinian liberation struggle is seeking a future that ensures that the people that live between the river and the sea, regardless of their religious or ethnic background, have freedom, justice, and dignity, and live in a place where life is flourishing. Those are the basics of the Palestinian struggle. Freedom means ending the occupation, no system of apartheid, being able to decide their own rules, even simple things like how much water each person gets, which we don't decide for ourselves, the Israeli military gets. Justice means that whether you are born in a settlement, if I were to walk you outside, you could see the settlement across my house. They are in swimming pools. They're enjoying their summer. As I don't have water, and as my neighbors and poor people living in refugee camps right next door to me don't have access to water, we can watch the settlers swim in their swimming pools. Justice means that whether you're born as a Jewish Israeli or born as a Palestinian, you get the same basic rights to that life. And centrally, dignity, if I were to tell everybody listening on this call what dignity means, dignity, to act with dignity, it means feeling a sense of pride in your community, a sense of empowerment, not being humiliated. We all intrinsically understand what that means. And that's what Palestinians are seeking, that type of life. And lastly, Palestinians want to live in a world where all life flourishes, because Palestinians are deeply connected to their land, deeply connected to their olive groves, deeply connected to their springs. It's part and parcel of being Palestinian. And because those things have been stolen from us, we've become more connected to them. And so if Palestinian liberation succeeds under the parameters of that struggle, freedom, justice, and dignity, and where all life flourishes, it will also mean that if you're of Jewish background, and this is one of the key problems of kind of the settler colonial Zionist project, is it is based on maintaining this idea that the Jewish people always need to live in fear. But in fact, if we achieve a social contract where all people get freedom, justice, and dignity, and where life is protected and is flourishing, that would be much safer for the Jewish people than anything that Zionism could promise or has achieved for them. But centrally, and why do I say achieving this for Palestine within the next 5 years can end the climate crisis? Because if the social contract here changes, then all of the surrounding countries, Palestine would become a lightning rod. And this is why, although Arab regimes say they support Palestine, anyone who studies Arab regimes know that they have never supported the Palestinian people. Because achieving this social contract in Palestine for all people, it destroys the rentier state social contracts that many of these nations have built for themselves, whether it's all the way from Morocco to Oman and the UAE. And Palestine could be the true spring, the true revolutionary spring that allows those different regimes to crumble, particularly if Palestinians adopt a policy of, similar to what South Africa tried to do at the beginning of its liberation, but adopt a policy of, South Africa attempted to adopt a policy of human rights, anti-racism, for that to be the foreign policy of South Africa in and across the region, anti-colonialism. South Africa has had challenges, of course, but Palestine could learn from South Africa and actually be a model for achieving a sustainable future. Because inside Palestine right now, we have the opportunity to ensure that Palestine is 100% green, in the sense that Palestine runs totally on renewable energy. That's where part of my background is, in the alternative energy space. That calculation is not a figment of my imagination. It's very possible because Palestine has desert, Palestine gets sun over 300 days per year, and it has mountains that have wind for long parts of the year, and it has a sea. We could use those different sources to create a fully renewable clean energy space. And most Palestinians want that because Palestinians understand the risk of being dependent on key power sources. And actually all of the key fossil fuel sources or electric generators, whether they're on coal or on natural gas, belong to the occupation or allies of the occupation. So Palestinians want to move away from that to achieve that independence. And if you move in that direction, you can then have Jordan move in that direction, you can have Lebanon move in that direction, and you can broadly change the political dynamics of the region step by step. Because going back to the argument of US hegemony, if Palestine achieves freedom and US hegemony is weakened in the region, all of these fossil fuel producing settler colonial born states will have less of a power backing them and less legitimacy within their people. And so I named that because it's crucial for us to understand that it's not only abstract philosophical thought, there's actually a way to connect the liberation of Palestine with ending the climate crisis that is realistic. Because if we manage to achieve that liberation for Palestine in the next 10 years and transform the region as a result of that, then the climate crisis will be much easier to crack because of that change in political dynamics and interests that define the extractive capitalist kind of colonial systems that exist around us today. And I think that anybody who cares, if we want to, I sit in a lot of climate justice rooms, climate justice meetings, and there's always this very logical argument that we need to pursue all the paths that we can take, from what Extinction Rebellion do, which is disrupting society, to what the advocates do at COP, which is engaging and negotiating and debating. And I would say that one of the strategies, if we want to diversify, one of the strategies we need to add to stopping the climate crisis is liberating Palestine through a model of climate justice down that path. And so that's the first argument I'll make. For the sake of time, I won't elaborate on it more. But I'll shift to the second piece, which is just the creativity of the Palestinian people, of my people, in these dire circumstances, which is, as the people in Gaza face what the UN said was going to be an impossible, unsurvivable place, that Gaza would be an unsurvivable place to live. And they said that before this war. Imagine, Gaza was, people shouldn't have been able to survive in Gaza. 90% of the water was toxic. It was completely under siege. It had been significantly destroyed in 2014, and yet people still survived. And the West Bank, how communities survive without water. If we, I hope that we succeed in solving the climate crisis, but even if we don't do that, because Israel's imposing manufactured starvation, man-made starvation, man-made thirst, man-made economic degradation on Palestinians, and we're still finding ways to survive, I think the world will begin to look at Palestinians as a model on how to survive in a world that's being destroyed by climate crisis. So Palestinians happen to be the hope of the world, no matter what scenario we go in. And this is why I would argue people need to ensure that they see the Palestinian people, that they support the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And I'll give you two key ways that we can do that. The first is, for everyone in this space, I recommend we start thinking and pushing fast to ensure that Gaza is rebuilt as a model of a place that's 100% green, 100% built on renewable energy, 100% built on sustainable resources. We have an opportunity to turn Gaza into a phoenix, into a model. Now, I've been in the humanitarian spaces and the government spaces and the spaces where the Americans and the Israelis and the EU try to rethink rebuilding Gaza, not in a way that benefits the people of Gaza or the climate or humanity, but in a way that makes the most money, going back to Tara, that makes the most money for some of the regimes in the region like Egypt, or from some of the companies allied to these different actors. We cannot let that happen. There should be a campaign starting right now that says Gaza needs to be rebuilt based on how the Gazan people want it to rebuild, based on a system that is sustainable and that does not rely on and is not built to be independent on fossil fuels coming from Israel or elsewhere. That's a campaign that we can all run. And then the second campaign that I would argue people in the climate justice space need to run is ensuring that they support one of the key campaigns that's being led by the BDS movement right now, which is a call to completely sanction and ban Chevron, because Chevron is the key company fueling the Israeli apartheid and genocide. It's the key company excavating and helping steal Gaza's natural resources, including its gas off of into the Mediterranean. And so Chevron needs to be completely shut down. And I don't think anyone in our climate justice space likes Chevron anyway. So this is a very easy one to jump onto if you are interested. And I'll stop here for time, but it's really an honor to be with all of you. And thank you for giving me this space.
Thank you so much, Fadi. That was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. So thank you very much for that contribution. I have a lot of questions for you. But I would also like, since we're getting close to the top of the hour, I'm completely happy to continue talking, but I'd just like to get a sense from our other panelists if they have any time pressure, or if you're also happy to continue, let's say, for another half hour. Nina and Tara, how are you placed?
I've probably got 15 minutes and then I need to go, but I can stay for 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. And Tara?
Yeah, I'm good to stay on until we're done. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Fadi, I was just wondering, the one question I had for you, I mean, I've got quite a few, but I was wondering from the position that you're in as director of Avaaz, what your sense of the popular movements around the liberation of Palestine are globally now, and what shifts we might have seen, and how that relates to the prospects for the change that you're talking about over the next months and years.
Thank you, David, for that question. I'd say a couple of things, which is, of course, it differs from one place to another. I mean, we've seen in kind of the Nordic countries, Sweden, and some of the climate movements there, of course, the movements in South Africa, in Brazil, in Colombia. I mean, one big victory in Colombia actually is that Colombia banned the sale of coal to Israel, which was a win-win situation for both the climate justice movement and the Palestinian justice movement. So there I'm seeing that people are waking up in the global south and some countries to the idea that the climate justice movement and liberation in Palestine and elsewhere, Congo, Sudan, are deeply intertwined, and people are beginning to theorize. This is why I like Tara's presentation, which is we need better language and discourse to kind of speak to that and how that looks like, but people sense it instinctively, and so you see them jumbling these issues together. And I think that is very positive for the future because of the two-fisted aspects of settler colonialism and its harm. So we're kind of tying them both down. In some countries, I see that, like Germany, for example, there has been a very dangerous and sad attempt to try and argue that any type of speaking up for Palestinian rights is anti-Semitic, and consequently, the climate justice movements and similar, movements related to environmental rights have been silent or silenced to speak about Palestine, and the debate has been turned toxic on that front. And so, in those places, I think more work needs to be done. But I do think we're moving in a kind of direction right now that is positive in this sense, and I think we need to ensure that we build on it, and we need to also ensure that we include all voices equally. And what I mean by that is indigenous communities oftentimes are the last communities to be listened to and to be engaged, and sometimes countries, including Brazil, to be fair, can have a very radical position on the rights of Palestinians, but then not do enough to protect their own communities that are victims of settler colonialism. So we, as people who are engaged on Palestine, as some of this, this conversation is, including in South Africa, it's important that with your passion that you have for Palestine, you also look at internal blind spots, because if we don't act towards those internal blind spots in our countries, it may lead us to fragment as a movement. And as Palestinians, we understand the necessity of unity in the struggle, and avoiding, people who are, and fossil fuel companies do this all the time. They find fissures in movements and they try to divide and conquer. So, I see huge potential in this becoming a collective movement, but I also see large risks if we're not careful and if we don't thread ourselves together more closely.
Thanks so much, Fadi. That's really, I think, a very key point you're talking about addressing the internal inconsistencies within our own societies as well. And I mean, much as we in South Africa celebrate, for example, South Africa's taking Israel to court at the ICJ under the Genocide Convention, we also recognize that that our human rights policy on foreign policy on human rights over the last couple of decades has at times been less than ideal, while we also celebrate this particular victory. I do have other questions for you, but I would like to. First of all, I'm going to, towards the end, take an opportunity to suggest to people some actions that they can take on the that might relate to the thing that you mentioned about Chevron. So I'll get to that in a moment. But because I know Nina is running short on time potentially, I'd like to give Nina and Tara a chance to ask you any questions that they might have following your observations.
I mean, the one thing I would just say is, sort of drawing on what Fadi was saying, we sit here in the US, in New York in particular, we saw, the anti-genocide pro-Palestinian student protests, and I interviewed Omar from the BDS movement not that long ago, and he was at Columbia in exactly when the protests were going on in 86, calling on Colombia to divest from South Africa, at that time. And what he talked about and what we were talking about then is just that, the students at these universities, some of them more than others, but many of them are absolutely making these links, right? Because it isn't a coincidence that Columbia, Yale, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, we could name many, are the same universities that have invested in fossil fuel companies, in mining companies, in other extractive industries, right? And that are the same ones that invest in weapons or defense, that continue to invest in companies that enable the current occupation. I mean, these universities are, in the same way you could mainstream media, right, are absolutely been a key part of the colonial project and can continue to do so, right? I mean, it's, these universities are ones that have, benefited from and enabled the ongoing sort of fossil fuel production, and at the same time, and the colonial project, right? And I think they're a really key part of that. Like I said, I'd say the mainstream media as well. And to see the students were making those links, right? They were like educating themselves. I was at CUNY, the City University in New York, one evening when they were, learning about the Black Panther movement and the civil rights movement, and sort of learning and sort of educating themselves on the connections between, the South African, the divestment from the South African apartheid and the Vietnam War. And so I think young people are much more intersectional not naturally, but like they are, very much so in that space. You know what I mean? Like, I've never met a young climate justice activist in the US who also isn't concerned about migration or isn't concerned about other issues. You know what I mean? They're much less siloed as movements. They understand actually, how can you talk about climate justice? Like, if you want to talk about justice in any way, there aren't exceptions. You can't talk about climate justice and be like, okay, but it's okay that Gaza and the Palestinian people have been denied all access to water and food and all of those things. They don't see the world in that way, you know, and I think that's sort of so I think it's sort of, I think it certainly, for in my experience anyway, you know, that sort of and I certainly have seen that even more so among Indigenous, Black and brown activists and movements. Do you know what I mean? Like they're sort of connecting the dots, being intersectional is very much what they do and understand and how they experience the world anyway, right? And so I think it's sort of, certainly from an environmental point of view, the biggest challenge in sort of connected, being unified and being connected has come from the traditionally and historically white European, North American sort of organizations that have a lot of power and influence with governments at the UN climate summits, all of those things, you know what I mean? So I sort of, I'll just say that.
Tara, are there points that you would like to raise at this point?
Yeah, I think I really resonated with the point that Fadi made around not overlooking you know, these dynamics that exist within our contexts, and of, you know, I'm thinking now, right now I'm located in Cape Town. We've been having these really incredibly, horribly strong storms, and so many people have been displaced. And increasingly, I mean, the people who have been displaced are those who have historically been marginalized, and located in informal settlements, the majority of them. And so I think, you know, it's really important within the climate movement that we don't, we recognize, I think with any issue, that we don't get focused on a single issue and we recognize the interconnections. And I think in general, that's also something that we should acknowledge in terms of environmentalism and the history of environmental racism in the context of South Africa, that environmentalism has historically been often quite single issue. You know, conservation has been complicit in the dispossession of land in the South African context. In the context of Palestine, it's a quite frequently quoted example of how pine trees were used to erase the history of villages where people were expelled after the Nakba. And so I think it's also, we are held also to a higher responsibility to account for that past and to take responsibility for that sort of tarnished reputation of environmentalism, and really be clear that especially with climate change and addressing climate change, because it's so obviously not a single issue, it's so obviously interconnected, that we highlight all of these interconnections. And then there was just a point in the chat around South Africa still exporting coal to Israel, and that we should have a local campaign about this. I think that would be a great thing to discuss, because that definitely would tie to climate mobilizations that we could have in South Africa. But then also another thing which I briefly mentioned was around agrochemical imports from Israel, and how that ties into a broader conversation around African food sovereignty and more as a response to the climate crisis, and how, you know, these agrochemical industries and big ag in particular are working in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture. There's a long history of South Africa being kind of the entry point for Monsanto to come into the continent. So there's maybe, I see, and I'm obviously, again, no expert on this, but I see potential for maybe also linking boycotting of agrochemicals to the climate movement within, and building broader food sovereignty within South Africa and the African continent. And then, I'll maybe leave it there because I feel like I've spoken a bit too much now.
Thanks, Tara. Yes, and I mean, I think as Fossil Free South Africa, one of the things we're trying to do is to unpack the multiple harms caused by fossil fuels across so many realms, and I think there's all too little understanding of the way the industrialization of agriculture has been another vector for the damage done by the industry. I'm acutely aware, though, that Nina may need to drop out at this point, and I just wondered if there's anything that you'd like to say quickly, Nina, before you go. And to thank you so much for your participation this evening.
No, thank you all for having me. If people have questions or want to contact me, you can share my email. That's absolutely fine. And yeah, no, I've learned a lot from both Tara and Fadi, so thank you very much. And Fadi, I'm already got planned. I'm gonna send you an email to interview you for a story. So watch out for my email coming your way. But yeah,
Just need to be kind in the interview, but I appreciate it.
I'm always no, yeah, no, I was that. That would be great. But thank you. If anyone has, sorry, I have to leave now. But if anyone has any questions, please just get my email from David, and I'm happy to answer or help in any way.
Thanks so much, Nina. I don't think there were any specific questions for you. Otherwise, I would have put them to you. But but it's really great that you're open to being contacted that way. And thank you again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.
So I'm not going to go into too much more detail on my side, other than to say that there are a few reasons why, as Fossil Free South Africa, we wanted to host this. And I think we've touched on many of those shared dimensions of justice that are really important. But one of the other reasons is that as an organization, we had our roots particularly in a campaign for divestment from fossil fuels, and felt seeing what we're seeing around Palestine and the importance of the BDS movement in addressing what's happening in Palestine, which you've directly raised by mentioning Chevron, Fadi. There are comparatively few organizations that are using divestment as a tactic at the moment in South Africa, and we thought it was important, not only given that South Africa's the links with South Africa's own liberation to divestment, but also the links with Palestine, that we try to bring some of our experience with that particular tactic to bear on this. And so one of the things that we've done in trying to suggest ways that people might take things forward after this meeting is to put together a form that people can use to fill in, to start approaching their asset managers, to start taking responsibility for the contact that those asset managers have with companies that have been implicated by the UN in supplying arms to and funding the arms companies in Palestine. And I'd be very happy to add the name of Chevron to that list. And the other companies that we know, the other fossil fuel companies in particular that we know have been implicated, so that we can offer people that form of action to take after this event. I think, speaking for myself as well, I'm old enough to remember having grown up white in South Africa under apartheid, and have lived in a highly propagandized, highly racist society of the kind that it seems Israel has become, and to know what it was like to be constantly told that we were surrounded by enemies, and that there were people whose lives who were essentially considered to be disposable, or people to be told that there are terrorists all around us, and that these people should be disposed of essentially. I remember all that, and remember it with some pain and embarrassment as well, to the extent that I absorbed that at the time. And it's been something of a lifelong effort for me, and I'm so sure for many other South Africans, to try and unpick those things that still sit inside us. But I was wondering, Fadi, as well, you mentioned your direct experience. It's still controversial for a lot of people, it seems, to say that there's a system of apartheid in operation in Israel and Palestine. And you mentioned your experiences of having to see settlers who have far more access to water. But I wondered if you could perhaps give us a quick sense as well of what it means as a Palestinian to live under Israeli apartheid, and your personal experience of that day to day.
Yes, I mean it's I can speak for hours about it, but I'll pull out kind of 5 key examples about what it is like to live under apartheid. The first is imagine, growing up as a child, or if you have children, imagine that you are walking to your school, or just playing in your yard, and imagine a settler child comes that's in the neighborhood, your same age, let's say you're both 11 years old, and throws a rock at you, or spits at you, or hits you, and then you get into a scuffle. Now, if you are a kind of, Jewish Israeli settler, then what would happen, and let's say the police come. So what would happen is the Israeli police would come and they'd take you, call your parents, tell your parents, your kid was bad, and send you home with them. If they were like going to take you to the police station, which maybe happens 5% of the time, they would call a lawyer for you. And if they can't reach your parents, and they wouldn't put you in a prison cell. If they had to put you in a prison cell, they'd put you with other children in a juvenile detention center. Now, if you're the Palestinian kid, and let's say you didn't even start the fight, you wouldn't be arrested by the Israeli police. The Israeli military would take you. They would throw you in, you have a 2 in 3 chance, about a 63% chance of being beaten up by the soldiers as they take you to their military detention center. You wouldn't be allowed to call your parents. You wouldn't get any type of support. You wouldn't be told you have a right to a lawyer. If you know it, you could ask for it, but they'd probably delay the lawyer getting to you. And then they would throw you in the military detention center with other adults. And then you would go to a military court. Before you go to the military court, they'd interrogate you and essentially pressure you to admit that you did something wrong, because and your lawyer would sadly even advise you to just say that you did something wrong, because they can keep you for months, if not years, if they want to, because it's a kangaroo court system. So it's better to accept whatever deal they offer you, even if it means spending 6 months in prison. So that's one example of living under apartheid. The other example relates to traveling. So, and this, I was recently in South Africa, and a lot of South Africans have, remember the pass system where there were certain roads, certain areas they can't drive through. Well, if you're Palestinian, the same thing exists. So imagine I drove between Johannesburg and Pretoria, and you can kind of take a highway that's pretty much straight most of the way. If you're Palestinian and you want to go to a city like Jerusalem or Bethlehem, and you live in my city, which is about 15 kilometers away from Jerusalem and about 30 kilometers away from Bethlehem, we can't take the same roads because there are checkpoints and Israeli walls and military observation towers. So we are forced to take roads that are winding, that are dangerous, that only have one lane for most of the route, and that take 2 to 3 times as long. And even on those roads, there are checkpoints, which means that an Israeli soldier could stop you. And what they're doing now is, if they'll take your phone, if you have Instagram or WhatsApp, they'll open it. If they see that you posted something like Free Palestine, or if you're wearing a kufiya, they'll beat you up and throw you in prison. The third example of living under apartheid is just the opportunities to start anything, as simple as an alternative energy business. I mean, when I was doing my startups, we weren't given access to basic weather data, because as Palestinians we can't collect weather data, we can't put the wind speed towers or anything like that. Only the Israeli military can. But you need those things if you want to build wind turbines. Of course, they'll ban you, they'll try to stop you. I actually had to get a Jewish American friend of mine to fake that he's an entrepreneur and come and fly all the way from California to Tel Aviv and go to the Israeli military. And he's not Israeli, he's just Jewish American. And he could get that data saying that he wanted to start a project in an illegal Israeli settlement. Whereas as a Palestinian, they wouldn't give me that data. So, that's one example of many opportunities. And the last example is all of this together means that your life, they try to make your life worthless. And this is the most painful thing, which is any type of attempt to resist. I mean, I have been shot for marching with children who were trying to get to a spring that the settlers had confiscated from their area. And the soldiers came and they saw that I was the organizer and they shot me. And I could have died. I've been arrested and they tried to accuse me of being that I beat up 10 soldiers, and I am fit, but I don't think I could beat up 10 soldiers. Although I was kind of happy when they said that they thought I could. But then the soldiers came in and lied about it. And the only thing that saved me, I could have been in prison for close to a decade. The only thing that saved me is I got lucky, which was that somebody had taken footage, a video clip from their balcony of them arresting me. And so when I was in court and I had all these soldiers attesting that I attacked them, luckily the video popped out and my lawyer got it, and that prevented me. So our lives are kind of worthless. And that's the main and final thing I'll end with, is this whole system is designed to dominate us. And if we refuse this domination, to erase us. And that's what life looks like. And it's interesting, I then meet with, because of my work, I meet with German officials, I meet with American officials and others. And I'll tell you something. In private, they all tell me, including people as high up as, direct advisors, sometimes even foreign ministers. In private, they will say, we know that this is apartheid. Legally, as defined under international law, as people, I met with an ambassador who was in South Africa in the 80s from a European country, who helped the ANC bring in, supported the ANC in bringing down apartheid. And he told me, your situation is worse than what I saw in South Africa when I was there in the 80s. And yet he refuses publicly to say that it's apartheid. And so I have to say that it's not that it's controversial to say it's apartheid. It's not that it's questionable. It is a fact, and it's only cowardice to not call what's happening here apartheid. That's the basic aspect of it.
Yes, and people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and other South Africans who lived under apartheid when visiting Palestine have echoed what you said, which is that they feel that in many respects the system there is worse than what people had to live with and endure here. The other thing I'd like to ask you about, and we were in this situation where, to the extent that we see renewed concern from the international community over some form of settlement in Palestine, there is much talk once again of a two-state solution. For me, as a South African, hearing talk of a two-state solution sounds like calling for a return to the Bantustan policy that we had here in South Africa. I wondered what your perspective might be on the two-state solution.
Yeah, I mean, the two-state solution is a Bantustan solution. It's de facto the attempt to Bantustanize, Israel-Palestine. I'll say that, number one, it's not a viable solution. The truth is that, the majority of Palestinian people, their historic homeland, where they live, where they come from, is within what's now Israel, and they deserve a right to go back there. It wouldn't be manageable if they all returned to the West Bank and Gaza. We spoke about environmental degradation. And similarly, the truth is many people of Jewish background find cities like Hebron, like Jerusalem, including the Old City, and other parts of the West Bank, as places that they have a spiritual connection to. So the logic, even if you achieve some type of two-state solution, which is basically a solution that's ethno-nationalist, right? It's about separating. It's de facto apartheid. It's about separating to create two ethno-nationalist states. they wouldn't last long. And right now it's become impossible because of Israel's expansion and settlements in the West Bank. But so that's just from a practical level, from I'd argue a moral, philosophical level. It's also, I think what would be transformative here is, as I said, a struggle that's based on the values of freedom, justice, and dignity, and the flourishing of all life. And that cannot be achieved in a two-state solution paradigm. That can only be achieved in a different type of paradigm. And last but not least, it's many people are arguing for a two-state solution because it creates a process, and this is important. The peace process is an attempt to manage the conflict and turn it back into a zombie conflict that no one's paying attention to. So if you say, we want to have a two-state solution, we're going to go back to negotiations, then you're negotiating something that will never happen. But the whole world is looking at it like, they're negotiating, there's a peace process. So we just need to step back and wait until they agree. So it's a way to numb the international community and international solidarity in the wrong direction. So yes, I think most Palestinians now, especially the younger generation, are done with the two-state paradigm. And it's exactly because we came to South Africa as young leaders and saw what the Bantustan solution looked like. And we realized that it's a trap. And so we don't want to fall into it.
Thank you. I mean, that's illuminating. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that there's another parallel with fossil fuels here, which is that we see very cunning and clever public relations ploys from the fossil fuel industry, which we describe as greenwashing. And listening to you, it occurred to me that talk of the two-state solution and talk of the peace process essentially become negotiation washing of a frozen conflict.
It's exactly like that. And maybe one thing I'll add, and also before we end, just because of, connects to the intersection and also the great work that your team is doing on the divestment front, which is when I think there's an opportunity to, and I'm seeing this on some US campuses, and it's actually proving more successful, which is to merge the divestment calls related to human rights abuses in Palestine particularly, and related to fossil fuels. So, when students come together, they build these broad coalitions, and then they do encampments, but the demands in the encampments are not just, divest from this weapons manufacturing company because it's engaged in Israel. It's a whole gamut, and it's put together. And it makes all of the movements stronger because the fossil fuel free movement gets much more people mobilized for its cause, and the Palestinian movement gets a kind of much deeper logic and intersectionality in its asks. And both divestments serve one another, as we've been speaking to in this call. So
that's a great point to end on, I think. Thank you so much, Fadi. I would really like to thank you again and thank Tara for your participation this evening. Thank you so much for your time and your contributions and your insights and coming to joining us. I would just like to say to people that we do have another event planned on Gaza and this will be, the next one will be an in-person event in Muizenberg on the 3rd of August at the Commons in Muizenberg. I'm going to just quickly post all these details again in the chat for everyone to see. If you are still somebody who has questions about the various dimensions of the conflict in Gaza, there's a website that is quite useful for people who are hesitant to understand these things, called Bystanders No More, which might be worth looking at. If you want to contribute to support the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, we as South Africans, we know that Gift of the Givers is a very dynamic and strong humanitarian organization based in Africa, which is also supporting people in Gaza. And I've put the account details for Gift of the Givers donations to Palestine there. I've also included our Fossil Free SA website and the BDS Coalition website. And then not last but not towards the bottom, an opportunity to take investor action, to sign on to a letter to South African asset managers, asking them to look at their ties to companies that are helping to fuel this genocide. And as I mentioned, we will add the names of Chevron and other implicated fossil fuels companies to that list. So thank you all very much again for participating. Thank you everyone who has stayed on for this long discussion. We will, I think, take the opportunity to make parts of the video recording from this evening available, if that's okay with you, Fadi and Tara. Thank you all very much, and have a great evening further, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
and
you
we
all.
hope to stay in
Great
touch.
evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fadi. Thank you, David. And thanks, Emma and Amina.
Goodbye, everyone.